Thank you very much for that. I want to leap straight in and ask Roger some questions. We're really fortunate in having somebody who's been at the heart of teaching philosophy to children for many years. And I've spent a lot of my life writing books which are, I hope, accessible to children. But when we're talking about philosophy for children, it's something a bit different from teaching Plato and Aristotle to children. Could you say something, first of all, about what you understand philosophy for children to be?
Yeah. The founder, Matthew Lipman, already referred to, thought of it as a thinking skills program. I mean, he was a philosopher, a very wise one, and has done... Oh, yes. So I'm talking about Matthew Lipman, the founder. And he presented philosophy for children as a thinking skills program. So even the phrase teaching philosophy to children doesn't really fit the case, although it depends what you mean by philosophy.
Can I just leap in on that bit?
Yeah,
Is that because that implies a kind of empty vessel model of teaching? I've got the philosophy and I put it into the child, as it were.
Yeah. Well, look, I'm sure with the tradition here, and I know from my tutor Rosalind Hurst's house, the way that philosophy is taught in places like this is very different from how it might be taught even at A level, where there's what I call stuff to learn and you're expected to say the right things in the examination. And Mark quite properly referred to philosophical research and inquiry. And for Matthew Lipman, philosophy was essentially a practice, an activity, a search. And of course, you can take that as a search into the great thoughts of the great philosophers. And we don't despise that, but that isn't what philosophy for children is designed to do or does.
That makes it sound quite like what I thought I was doing as a philosophy lecturer. You know, philosophy isn't a spectator sport. To do it, you have to get down there and kick the ball around, as it were, not just sit in the stands. It's not, you can't study philosophy without philosophizing.
Sure.
Or if you do, it's just a parroting of philosophical arguments.
Yeah.
You have to make them your own. You have to develop reasoning towards conclusions, employ critical thinking skills. So is it something different from that you're talking about?
No,
because that's what university teachers often see themselves as doing. You may be teaching a specific course and there is a so-called literature associated with that, but there's the principal idea of doing that is to somehow be a catalyst for this critical engagement with the ideas. And I think the engagement is search for truth. I mean, that's quite old-fashioned, but there is a sense in which you are trying to get somewhere that you weren't when you started, employing critical thinking skills in the process, and of course drawing on the great ideas of the past.
Yes. Well, oh gosh, a lot to pick up on there, but I agree that the thrust of academic philosophy, if we call it that, that's huge and varied, and philosophy for children, which is pretty varied, is in an important degree a search for truth. You don't want to be basing any sort of conclusions on falsities or whatever. But I personally would frame it differently, and not just philosophy for children, but philosophy itself. I still have that old-fashioned, maybe sense, even older, of philosophy as a search for wisdom. And I think that is a different thing from the search for truth. Truth feeds into wisdom, but wisdom is more than just establishing facts. I guess you agree with that, or not?
I don't know whether philosophy has a monopoly on wisdom.
No.
I think there may be an overlap between the two.
Well, but yes, I'm not sure if I was claiming that it had a monopoly on wisdom. As a matter of fact, my concept of philosophy is a very wide one, and it includes the notion that anybody in almost any sphere who actually is sincere about trying to become a wiser, and maybe that's more controversial, a better person, is doing philosophy whether they call it or not.
But there is something distinctive about Matthew Lipman's approach to this, where he's got this idea of a community of inquiry or inquiry,
for sure.
that's very central to this.
Yeah.
And so it's a sort of collaborative thing. It's not the philosopher going off into his or her room, sitting in an armchair, and somehow arriving at some interesting conclusion and revealing the workings.
Yes, that is the case, and it's the case for a particular reason, which I'm hoping and fairly sure that people here would be interested in. The notion of the community of inquiry, which is very important in P4C, is actually rooted in American pragmatism. Can I just pause a minute, get a little bit of audience involvement, and say, how many people have heard of that phrase, community of inquiry, as a sort of thing? Yeah, okay, that's helpful to know.
About five
yeah,
out of 20 or 30.
It's not so many. And in a way, I'm not surprised, and in a way, I'm not too disappointed, although I will advocate to you that if there's one thing that you take away to research into, it may not be, and perhaps shouldn't be, philosophy for children. It should be the notion and the practice of the community of inquiry. Now, the reason why that is important in P4C, but within the tradition that Lippmann was operating, is because the person who coined the phrase is reputed to be Charles Peirce, an American scientist, philosopher, mid-19th century. A pragmatist, though nowadays they talk about pragmatists and forever we divide. But the notion that the pragmatists broadly had of truth was different from that of absolute truth that you find by, as it were, research individually and so on. It was very much the notion that it is a social construct and that you advance the understanding, appreciation of truth and maybe wisdom through collaborative inquiry. Very much what you were saying in terms of your approach to lecturing. Now that isn't, again, a uniquely philosophical practice. The notion of the community of inquiry was originally applied to the community of scientific inquiry, what we now call the scientific community, yeah? And the principles are the same, that no one person has all the knowledge, the truth, the wisdom, and you put your ideas out there and you see what other people think and potentially change your mind or
but this is something different from the wisdom of crowds, isn't it?
The
wisdom of crowds. The idea that if you have a diverse group of people, you get more information out of a conversation than if you have a lot of homogeneity in a group.
Yeah.
It's about the kind of interactions that you have and where that takes the discussion.
Yeah.
So what does that mean in practice? You're talking about children. You haven't said how old the children are.
Sure.
But when you have a group of primary school children, how do you put this notion of a community of inquiry into practice?
Yeah, okay. So Lippmann experimented in the late 60s and early 70s by writing what he called philosophical novels. They're essentially stories about children in which children talk with each other about a variety of things, some of which might be very mundane, but often the heart of it was some sort of philosophical concept or issue that they wrestled with in the books.
Could you give a specific example? Because it's easier to latch on to something and see how that would be philosophical.
That's a good question. Yeah. Well, one of the things that he himself was quite struck by was the ancient Greek, what do we call it? Not triptych, but trio of beauty, truth, and suddenly I've lost it now. Goodness, beauty, truth, and goodness. Yeah, and of course, people will say those may be very intimately connected. Let's not unpack that now. But it's almost a counter to the notion, which we can address, and maybe some people want to address it, that children don't have enough experience or don't have enough, as it were, brain size or whatever to deal with big ideas like beauty, truth, and goodness. But in the stories, the children will talk about stealing. Is stealing right or wrong? And I've just been following your Twitter feed, actually, Nigel, and
Dangerous.
dangerous. And one of the people said, well, children don't have enough real world experience to talk about these things. Well, it's stuff and nonsense, that. Look, kids know from virtually age 3 and possibly earlier what's right and wrong, what's fair and not. Now, when I say they know, I don't just mean that they've been told that stealing is wrong, which of course they often are, and rightly they should be. But they know from bitter experience that stealing is wrong, or thumping someone is wrong, or this or that. So, at least in the basics of ethics, sorry, am I getting too passionate about this? Well, they have more than enough experience to realize that there are big questions that, either they ask or other people ask, or that they're involved in resolving. And the challenge, though, of course, is that, if they're just brought up in what we might call the small family community, then their ethical education, which is going on pretty much all the time, is not very philosophical. It might be dogmatic, it might be out of habit, it might be convenient or whatever, but it's not, by and large, going to be a philosophical discussion as between parents and children.
So would you do something like take some of the ideas from the beginning of the Republic and say, well, you say stealing is wrong, but imagine you've got this ring, and if you twist it, it makes you invisible, the ring of Gyges. Would you still think that stealing is wrong? Because you could get away with it then. Is it just that you get caught that makes it wrong?
It's one of the stories that nowadays many people who begin P4C actually use as a sort of starter story. I mean, Lippmann there's some great stuff in the Lippmann materials.
And in Plato.
And in Plato. And look, he was a very wise and knowledgeable person. And he was feeding into his stories all sorts of what we would instantly recognize, not just as philosophical ideas, but philosophical theories. Yeah. Is truth a matter of consistency, or is it a matter of coherence? But he doesn't use that language. And rightly so, because that's where even teenagers and probably undergraduates get a bit lost, in the language of academic philosophy. That's a challenge, and I'm not knocking it, but you can explain. I mean, Bruner, in another sphere, psychology, said any idea that has integrity can be taught to younger minds with integrity. Now, I don't wholly agree with that, because I'm not sure if even I can master quantum mechanics just like that. But actually, philosophy has the beauty of some very simple practical ideas, which we are teaching to each other all the time, parents to children, partners to partners, and so on. We're using this language all the time. And what we can do is help the students to, now look, here's another thing. I don't talk now about analyzing concepts. When I was here 50 years ago, analytic philosophy was like a big thing, and I'm not knocking analysis. That's very important. But I'm much more interested both now, and I think I always was, though that's retrospective and might be false memory, in what I call constructing concepts. Now, a concept like goodness or beauty or truth is a concept that I think open-minded, enlightened people are continually reconstructing. In fact, reconstructing is a better notion than constructing, because we have these concepts of beauty, but if you're presented with something that someone else says is beautiful and you don't think it's beautiful, of course, you could just say, oh, well, it's all a matter of opinion, it's subjective and so on. But no, that's not the correct philosophical approach to this. You want to say, well, what are your criteria for beauty? What are my criteria? Are there common criteria? Are we talking about the same sort of thing? That's a philosophical endeavor. And you can get students involved in that. So you quote the Ring of Gyges. That's a great story that we can use even with 6-year-olds to get them into that whole sphere of what's right and wrong, who says so, what's about, consequentialism is in there, and so on. And the same could go for beauty. We take children to the art gallery, or we show them pictures, and the usual process to give a little bit more flesh to it is that you present the children what we call a stimulus. might be called a provocation. Anyway, something that puzzles them or might just tweak them a little bit. And it's not just Lippmann stories, it can be folk tales, it can be extracts from Plato, suitably suitable register, pictures, photos. The world's your oyster, I often say. Having said that, you know, a class, however old they are, if you just said, well, look, if I said, what do you think of that? And put that phone and said, all right, that's the stimulus for today. Let's have some ideas. You'd think I was a bit wacky. I think you'd probably think I was a bit wacky, but you'd probably play the game a little bit and maybe we'd get into social media and all the rest of it. But I've put a plastic, with an experienced group of children, put a plastic bottle on the table and said, right, let's have some ideas about that. And they go into their little groups and they chatter about it. And sooner or later, they latch on to some big idea, as I call it. It might be, what is humanity doing to the environment? It might be, how important is water, or da-da-da-da. And then what happens is that we ask the groups to form questions themselves. So you might have half a dozen groups and you get a choice of 6 questions. And then you say, right, well, what do you think will be the most interesting or the most important to talk about? Choose a question, and then you have a philosophical inquiry. That's the shape of it, really.
It seems to me that it's not just the content. You know, you're talking about ethics or politics or eco-philosophy, as it were, but the etiquette of conversation, something that professional philosophers aren't that hot on, actually. That you're modelling good behaviour, that you're modelling a way of having a discussion that is civilized, recognizes the diversity of opinion, learns from other people, develops arguments through conversation. Things which I think are incredibly central through the history of, that are central through the history of philosophy, that philosophers haven't actually operated in isolation from one another. They've always been talking to each other, writing to each other, or if they can't actually communicate in that sort of way, they're interacting through books and articles and so on. But they're not outside of communities. They're always parts of communities. But you're modelling a way of having a civilized conversation and accepting that there will be differences in that group. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it's absolutely right. Civilized conversation, yes, but you could have a civilized conversation. We were having some out there just now about this, that, and the other, lovely cakes, beautiful time of year, da-da-da-da. And that could go philosophical, of course, it could, you know, are we a privileged group here, and what's privilege, and, you know.
Can you have your cake and eat it?
Thank you, very good, lovely. So in a way, I think you point me back to the thing that people would often say and ask, which is, you know, well, what's the philosophical aspect of these children's discussions? Now, insofar as they might touch on ethics or politics or the environment or whatever, then, you know, on the face of it, you've got a philosophical discussion going. But I think the process is, when it's done well, is much more the recognition that there are key concepts, and I don't mean like key for living, I mean key to the particular thing you're talking about, that you need to clarify, that you need to explore, and as I say, you know, stretch. That's another metaphor I use, to stretch your concepts. And that does relate to, you know, differences of experience as well as differences of opinion. So I often use this idea. Can I do this, or am I taking you off stream here? Well, I'll have a go. Look, you see, a lot of people say, yes, I know, concepts, those are abstract things. And philosophical concepts, those are the most abstract things. And that's really tough. And, you know, it's only for the elite and who can handle it and the rest of it. And I just think that's a complete misconception of concepts. And I use that word advisedly. Every word is a concept, including the, all right? May not be a very interesting concept, that, but every word is a concept. So look, my wife loves horses. I knew nothing about horses until I met my wife and she started doing horses. Now, the concept of horse means different things to different people. It obviously does. When people say, no, there's only one concept of horse, it's a horse. That's what a horse is. check the definition, that's your concept of horse. Now, I choose that example because some of you will know from Dickens' Hard Times, the notion of Thomas Gradgrind, who wanted definitions. He thought that concepts were to be, as it were, captured and tied down in definitions. And so one boy in his class, Bitzer, had the perfect definition of a horse. He got full marks. The girl he asked, who couldn't answer it, Sissy in the story, she was conflummoxed because she didn't know a definition of horses, but her father was a horse trainer. She knew more about horses than either the other smart-ass in the room or the teacher. Now, what are we to say then? That he had a better concept of horses than she did? No. She had a better concept of horses. Now, this is going on all the time. So let me take something back to you. You said, well...
So I'm still thinking about the horse and whether the concept is better because you've interacted with horses, or whether it's better because you can articulate what's distinctive about a horse. But
that's a very fair point. I think given time she could articulate, and maybe she would need either a language expert or a philosopher to, as it were, unpack her learning, her understanding. And incidentally, I'm very keen on the word appreciation. There's curricula throughout the world that talk about knowledge and understanding and skills. There's no curriculum, to my knowledge, whether we're talking school curriculum or even most university curriculums, that talk about appreciation, valuation. What's the point of education if we don't value what we're learning? Now, of course, if you devote your life to academic philosophy or science, then of course, by necessity, you value it. But how many children leave school having got A star in geography, history, and never read a geography book again in their lives? It's the vast majority. And that's because education is largely about repetition of knowledge, a little bit of skills, and very little to do with what makes life valuable and worthwhile, which might take me back to the origin of philosophy and philosophy for children, because part of what the drive is towards is to create a little bit of space in children's formal lives when they can think about their lives and think about them in a meaningful and meaning-making way. I'm beginning to sound like my father, who was a clergyman and was on his lectern.
But it's also enjoyable. That's the thing. That's what shouldn't be lost. The kids love this, and the teachers love it, and it's creative and fun, and seems to be going in a good direction. But from outside, it may seem that people are just splitting hairs. And how do you justify it within a school where there's a degree of skepticism about the value of the enterprise?
Yeah. Well, that's where you can talk about skills and should talk about skills. And you've identified them a little bit before, because there are, I think, not unique to philosophy, because after all, you know, scientists, historians know how to argue, they know how to produce evidence for their arguments and so on. But I think it is fair to say that philosophers, the best philosophers, whether it's in writing or in oral communications, value certain things perhaps more than, well, certainly the average person and probably the average academic. So they value clarity, they value consistency, they value argumentation that's open-minded and this and that. So as I say, there's overlap between all the disciplines here. Actually, I should say another thing, and it's probably controversial, but I still think that the likes of Charles Peirce as a scientist is essentially doing philosophy. I think historians are essentially doing philosophy. In fact, every teacher and subject, they're doing philosophy, but they just don't call it that. They call it history, they call it this or that. Philosophy is the mother of all subjects. That's a cliche. But actually, you've only got to ask yourself the question, why am I studying history? To realize that it's a philosophical enterprise. Well, normally speaking. I mean, I guess you might just do it for the money, but I would have thought you'd do it because you love it, you value it. That's a philosophical position. Now, I think all teachers should be philosophical, but actually all teachers are philosophical. The question is whether they should be better philosophers.
Now, if I was teaching music,
Yep.
somebody plays a note offbeat or sharp or flat, they've made a mistake, and I can identify the mistake and correct it, and there is a correct answer. How that piece should be played. I mean, there's a range of interpretation and so on, but musical teachers know that somebody's singing off key and they correct students. If you've got a group of vulnerable primary school students chatting about how we should live, and one says, oh, we should live by this religious precept, another one says, oh, that's rubbish, and somebody else uses a very poor set of arguments to a conclusion about how we should live. How do you deal with those sorts of things? Because you can't just say, well, actually, it's not like being an undergraduate. You say, well, from your premises, that conclusion doesn't follow. You surely can't do that with a 7-year-old in front of their peers.
You probably wouldn't use that language. But I think you could nudge them. I think that's how I would see it. You'd be nudging them individually, but the group as a whole. So a standard, it's not a ploy, it's a strategy really, is if someone says something that, you know, it is off the planet or up the wall, then the first thing you would do as a facilitator of conversation, you might say, well, that's an interesting thing to say. What
if it isn't interesting though? Well, it would. Inauthentic, and they pick it up, surely. If it's just wild, surely you say that's interesting. Everybody knows interesting means off the wall.
Well, that I think would depend on how you've, as it were, conducted the process thus far. I mean, I'm a great believer that teachers should be as authentic as possible. I mean, like almost 100% authentic. And actually, well, I'm just speaking for myself now. If a child says something that I think is completely wacky, I actually do find that very interesting. I think, well, why are you saying that? But I wouldn't say it like, why are you saying that? And humiliate them or anything like that. I just, well, that is interesting. Let's think about that. That's the thrust of the process. So does anyone have any response to that? You'd say that. And then, well, in a way, you just have to go with the flow a little bit. I mean, if everybody says, yeah, actually, that's a great idea, you know, we should buy into that, let's start a campaign. Then you've got
truth by consensus, which is not a reliable way.
It's not a reliable sense. No, indeed, it's not. But, and again, I take a slightly unconventional view of this. There are those who say that if the students either have a false premise or have a bad argument resulting in an objectionable conclusion, like the color of your skin should determine your status in society or something like that. And that's not completely out of the question that a child would say that. There are those who say, well, you should step in as a teacher and say, well, actually, you're wrong. You know, that's not how it should be or how it is. I don't take that view because, for two reasons. Firstly, I don't think it will work. Typically, even though the philosophical facilitator actually doesn't wear the hat of the authoritative teacher, you're trying to facilitate the conversation rather than direct it or tell people. But still, you're the grown-up in the room, they're the kids. And if as a grown-up you say to a child, well, you mustn't think that, what are they going to do? They're going to think that. Well, they're certainly not going to change their mind in public. And my guess is that they might not change their mind at all. So I see that this whole thing as a development in the child, in the community, over time, towards, and I'll give you these 4 adjectives. Lippmann was a very thoughtful person, and he's written that this is the aim of philosophy for children, to help children to become more thoughtful, more reasonable, more considerate, and more reflective. I'll repeat that because these are important words. Okay, so he thought that philosophy for children, as a prime aim, should help children to become more thoughtful. Well, it's all about thinking, so they're certainly going to be exposed to a lot of thoughts, right? More reasonable, that's where we have a responsibility as philosophical facilitators to guide the children towards better reasoning. But that's not just telling them, that's like helping them to find it over time. The third one was more considerate. Now, that's to me a slightly unusual word there, but I think it speaks to that thing that you were talking about when you're trying to create a community where people respect each other. And don't just respect them as that they're clever or they're good at this or good at football, but respect them as persons. Say, oh, okay, your experience is different from mine. I'm going to listen to you. I might not agree with you, etc., etc. So consider it. And then the last one is reflective. Now, I think that's the most important thing that we can encourage in children as a sort of life skill. To be reflective, to realize that what they've been listening to, what they've been thinking, how they've been acting may not be for the best. And there may be better and other ways of thinking and behaving. And sorry, I wanted to just say one more thing because I realized we should open this up very soon. Reflection. Yes. You asked earlier about how can you, in a sense, justify the time to people who've got exams to tests that get the children through, and all the many pressures on teachers at all levels, unfortunately nowadays. And the strongest case for doing philosophy for children at the instrumental level is not really whether the children are more considerate or even whether they're more thoughtful and reasonable. It's whether they actually develop self-correction, the ability to look at what they're doing and say, I could do it better.
So we both lived through a digital revolution, the invention of the internet, and people's perspectives have changed, and availability of information, reliable or not, has dramatically changed for young children, for young people, for adults as well. How has that affected what goes on with P4C? Because it must be possible for children to come in with all kinds of new perspectives that would never have come into the discussion before. But also they've got new vulnerabilities. They've got to develop skills of skeptical skills of assessing where information comes from, whether it's likely to be reliable or not as well.
Yeah.
Has that changed the way this philosophy for children is done?
I don't think it's changed the way it's done, but I think it's changed the rationale for doing it, or maybe maybe what you expect out of it. I actually think, and again, look, I'm completely devoted to this, so I may be overstating the case, but I think as time goes by, the case for doing philosophy for children grows and grows more and more urgent. And the reason for that is because if children, or indeed adults, because that's another thing I must come back to and tidy up in a minute. If all of us get more and more contained, if you like, within our social bubble or our intellectual bubble or whatever it is, and it seems to me that is happening, at least in the political level, but quite possibly at other levels, with the BBC and all that, multi-channels. I watch the fishing program morning till night. Fair enough, if that makes you happy. Now, I'm not knocking fishing. I'm not knocking fishing. But what I'm saying is that, there is this drift to separating people into different categories, into different interest groups, and so on. And what philosophy for children does, it really grounds you, because for 1 hour a week, as it were, you're all focused on the same topic, idea, issue, and you're in the best practice, you're exchanging different ideas about it, different experiences, and thinking about what role should this play in my life, in our life, as a classroom, as a school, as a community, and so on. So maybe I just go back to that notion. And Dewey was very big on this, John Dewey. He thought that democracy, properly speaking, should be like one massive community of inquiry. Well, look at America as it is. I'm sorry, am I offending anyone there?
Not yet, but carry
not
on.
yet, but carry on. I mean, look at UK as it is, you know, democracy, for goodness sake, come on, we need to analyze and reconstruct that notion, among others. And I say we, who is going to do that? I mean, it's for the younger people, really. I'm too old to be put up for Parliament. But anyway, I'm going off on one. But Dewey said that democracy was about creating, if you like, a spirit of inquiry in society, which is actually guided by the ideal of what to the common good.
Well, I'll open it up to questions in a second, but I'd just like to add to that, I mean, I'm passionate about teaching philosophy, and I do think it's very important within a democracy that you have articulate people capable of giving reasons in defense of arguments, knowing the difference between refute and repudiate, that kind of thing. It's very important, and it can raise the level of conversation. But there is a kind of wishful thinking sometimes involved, that if we just facilitate critical thinking, then we will get a better world. And plenty of people who were guards in Auschwitz were very good at reasoning. They just were reasoning from very bizarre premises, but they were very, very good critical thinkers, no doubt. Absolutely meticulous in following the steps of the argument. And it doesn't guarantee anything whatsoever. So I'm sort of just adding a note of caution about the idea that democracy will flourish when you have people who are very good critical thinkers. My cynical view is that, like many variants on philosophy, you get very good at rationalizing your prejudices.
And we've become more aware of that.
And we know many of our politicians, many of the worst of our politicians study philosophy, many of them at Oxford. It didn't immunize them against having obnoxious views.
I think you're probably right.
Right, good. That's a good thing to say. End on. Good note to end on. I'm probably right. Can I take some questions from this? John.
I was fascinated and interested, but not in a cynical sense, your comment about you making a racist. You also said that it's important. Of course, if you have this uncorrected racism, of that totally undermines the understanding.
Yes.
So I wondered how you explain that.
Yes. It would be very unfortunate, I think, if that remark came, as it were, near the bell and was like the end remark in a session. So it would clearly be grist to the mill, if you like, if it came in the middle of a session. And I think, I mean, obviously this is hypothetical, but I think I and probably most experienced P4C practitioners would say, well, they'd almost certainly say something like this: well, you realize that's a controversial view, don't you? And that's okay, because you're stating a fact. It is a controversial view, and the child needs to be aware of that. That doesn't knock down the argument or the conclusion, of course, but you then might say to the other children, what would be the consequences if we started operating on the basis of this principle or this, okay? And so you'd actually engage the students in more thinking about at least the consequences, if not the innate, if you like, values within the statement. And so,
What if
yeah.
says, well, I'm not going to engage with counter-arguments.
Ah, yeah.
They don't count.
No.
So he's not just avowing them.
Yeah.
They're acting.
He's acting on it.
He now forces
Yes.
them from acting on it.
Yes. Well, I think I've made clear that I wouldn't, as a P4C practitioner, and we're pretty strict about that. I mean, I also respect teachers' professional judgment, and in actual fact, in some schools they would have procedures whereby that would have to be reported, out of class.
Illegal. I think it's illegal to tolerate racism in the classroom.
I think that may be the case, but I think this is a very grey area. to be honest, and I'd be very surprised if teachers are very clear in their minds when they should and how they should. But I mean, on the one hand, it is obviously potentially a very profound concern if this sort of thing emerged. What I can say on almost as a counterbalance is that I've never experienced it myself, and maybe that's, you could say, well, that's because they wouldn't dare say it in front of you. But I'm not that sort of teacher, you know. I think it's almost the reverse scenario, that if you build up a sense of safety and respect through dealing with issues that most of the children find, you know, a common ground in, and if it then moves into these more controversial areas, you've actually got a different platform from which to either make the challenge, or better still, encourage the other children to make the challenge and talk it through. And the other thing that I would just say is this, that in a way, I think there is no alternative to just hanging on in there and hoping for the best, even if it's over-optimistic. Because essentially, if the child has that opinion and it's an authentic opinion, then there's a history behind that, both a personal history and a cultural history. And you're not, as an individual teacher or even as a class, going to radically change that unless you can create almost a different way of thinking. And that's what, in a sense, one's trying to cultivate through the philosophical approach. You know, the philosophical way of thinking is not to be so dogmatic, not to be so disrespectful of others, and so on. Yeah.
That's interesting, because I think historically that's not accurate about the philosophical way, in the sense of what philosophers do. Yeah. They're not typically incredibly respectful of people with whom they disagree. And they're not
I'm not going to comment.
particularly good at this kind of etiquette of argument, which is more like, and I think it's important that it's like this, it's more like a non-directive psychotherapist, the sense in which you're not judging people, but facilitating a discussion, which is quite a different role from what many professional philosophers take on. So, I mean, it rightly involves training and practice. It's not just something you walk into.
No, I think that's true. Yeah. P4C, yeah.
I've watched my students studying philosophy, probably do get more thoughtful, more reasonable. Not sure they get more
considerate.
Should this be a role that I have for them? And if so, how do I help them do that?
Yeah.
So do you think there's a difference between children and philosophy? And I'm just interested in how you would go about fostering.
Yeah. I suppose I probably want to separate your role, one's role as a teacher with a job. And I had a job, I was a maths teacher at one point, an English teacher, and essentially your job was to get the students to raise the standard of their maths or expression and pass some tests now. And that's not, I think, wholly your purpose, but it's part of it. And the university will hold you to certain standards of achievement, if you like. In the end, I don't think, even if you were excellent in that role, I don't think that's what would make you a good teacher. Not in the broadest sense. Do you mind if I share a moment the conversation we had upstairs before? So you had a university teacher. I've never met him. What was his name again?
Hubert Dreyfus.
Okay. Who you just said was a great teacher. Now, what made him a great teacher? The fact that he introduced you to new ideas, helped you clarify them, helped you get a love of them? Or was it a bit more than that?
Well,
Yeah. Would it be going too far to say that he impressed you, or you admired him, you valued him as a person as well as an intellect?
I enjoyed him immensely.
Yes.
Yes, I valued him as a person. I don't think he was a moral exemplar.
No, I don't think that even has to be the case. And you know, some great teachers, I suspect, are less than considerate of their students. So I'm not perhaps suggesting that being considerate is like the paragon of virtues for a teacher or a person. I think, however, I would probably argue that it plays a part in relationship. And I think relationship is important between teacher and student. I think it is between student and student, and probably teacher and teacher. You asked the question, you know, how might helping, I don't think training is the right word, educating youngsters to be more considerate, be different from that process with older students. And actually, I'm not sure if it would be so very different, Mark. I mean, I've not given it that much thought. But to me, the virtues of teaching, of being a good teacher, are pretty much universal. And I don't think they're confined to formal education. I mean, some of the greatest teachers aren't like teachers in the sense that they've not been labeled that. And our parents can teach us. Everybody is able to teach, and they do it really well when they engage with the person and they want the best for the person. Yeah. And if you model that, I think, yeah, sorry, said enough.
I don't know that being a good teacher is the same as being a good philosopher. And some people can be very good philosophers who teach indirectly by modeling being a good philosopher, but what they're modeling is testing ideas to destruction with a real passion that doesn't really allow people to disagree with them very much. And also people have an amazing nose for what's really important and don't want to get sidetracked by people with little ideas that aren't actually going to help them in getting to their goal. I mean, I don't think it's straightforward that being a wise, good person is part of being a good philosopher. It's not a straightforward relationship.
No.
And we conflate at university level teaching and philosophizing. I mean, they are integrated in some ways, but you don't have teachers and then the people who are doing the research. They're the same people, and all those things get muddled up. I mean, my best teacher was known for being aggressive in the style of argument. And when I understood him better, is because he really cared about the arguments and thought twice as fast as anybody. He could see the faults that lay in these sort of petty criticisms. It was like a chess player a long way ahead. And similarly, Bernard Williams was a bit like that. I mean, I learned a lot from seeing Bernard Williams in action. He's just, you know, how bad at philosophy I am when you see somebody who can really do it. It's like watching Pele or something. You think, wow. And you learn other things, but he wouldn't necessarily tolerate fools gladly, which is something which is different in a school. Anyway, sorry, I'm Marion next, and then
When I talk to children, I don't have children myself, but when I talk to children, I notice that they quite like to and I enjoy that. But my response to that is always to say, "Oh, why do you think that? Tell me your reasons." And usually, when I see children, it's in parents will at that point jump in, and because they think I'm attacking.
Yes.
You're familiar with the dynamic.
Yeah, I think so.
I mean, it is part of the point to actually give children the space in which to realise how important it is to offer reasons for their opinion.
Yeah. Definitely, Marion. And I think it can go further, because I think this is part of their growth process. Until they've articulated the thoughts, they don't know they've had them, as it were, or they don't know exactly what they think. And then when they put them into the public forum and find that not everyone agrees, or that people want to refine it or whatever, then they can say, oh, actually, maybe I've changed my mind. And it happens often enough for it to be one of the real joys of doing philosophy for children, is that children will say, oh, I think I've changed my mind. And that doesn't happen very often in adult conversation of this nature, I have to say. And it's because the kids, in a sense, they're not wedded to opinions. They like having opinions, and they like hearing other people's opinions. But, the older you get, perhaps the more opinionated you get. I think that's probably a reasonable generation. Why wouldn't you? Exactly so. Yeah, yeah. Thank you.
Why do you believe that? I said, why do you believe that? I'm just teasing you.
Why it's important to have reasons. Sorry, Jonathan's telling me to find some reasons. Why do I think it's important? Because an opinion without reason is maybe parroted, maybe it's just come off the top of your head. The fact is, it's not a full opinion. If you can't back it up with arguments or evidence, then it's just hanging in the air. And I think, children are often fascinated by being asked for their opinion. Quite frustrated when their parents pin them down.
My question then would be, can't there be space for some kinds of beliefs that we have prior to reasons, which we have learned through bodily involvement in the world? We've got, just like a sports person knows the right thing to do without having a kind of complex articulated volition internally, we have those sorts of ways of acting which are prior to reasons, which are built on our experience, and we may not be very good at giving the reasons, but we know it's the right thing to do. And I think a lot of ethics is like that. A lot of ethics is like that, about not reason giving. Sorry?
If you say to me,
yeah. But when I say what's the right thing to do, you can grasp for reasons, or you can just know this is the right. Like somebody's lying, suffering, and you know the right thing to do is to help them. You don't go through a whole complex set of articulating reasons.
When I'm teaching class, I can tell whether they've understood what I say. But if you ask me to explicate that knowledge, I wouldn't be able to do it. It's just as one human being.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, and there are many, I think philosophers are in danger of undervaluing those kinds of beliefs and reactions to the world, because we're so obsessed with giving reasons. I'm just slightly playing devil's advocate, but I'm interrupting the question. There's another one up there.
So I've got two, I think, related questions. I'm interested in trying to, let's say, practice higher education courses that are not big. And it's fun, but it feels like a global intervention. And I laud everything you do. Likewise. So I think it's like the question is, one, what you said earlier, as philosophy should our education, say primary education, not be only before you get preparing for. And the second one, which is related,
Mm.
Example, for example, there was body of evidence around positive effects on young boys in particular that can be had by spending time with men that's not their partners.
Yeah, I think there's probably three questions there. So the first one around subjects at primary level. I think that the problem there is that there are, if you like, not just procedures, but content that are very obviously of a certain nature that differ. And I don't see how one could sort of like teach about the environment without referencing, you know, geography or biology. But most primary schools don't actually chop their day up into like history, geography, and so on. They do, I think, have a more open approach to curriculum design. So I think I fudged that first question, to be honest. I don't think it's so critical. What I do think is critical is the way that the secondary schools operate, because they have their departments. Those are often quite powerful influences on what the school does or what it celebrates and so on. And in my, sad to say, or perhaps proud to say, 50 years of being involved with teaching, I've seen so many attempts to do cross-curricular work in secondary just go nowhere because the departments, well, to be fair, they often don't have the time to construct a project and so, and I think that's really sad. I think that's really sad because, you know, if there were much more project work, and that's how you'd construct it really, we're going to look at this as a project which is informed by the different subjects, and we'll all put our bit in there. That will be so much healthier. Right, now the role of philosophy in that. Well, you've got a handout. I hope you'll read it to the very end. I have a sort of fairly late career passion for what I call philosophical teaching. And that's not the same as P4C. It's not even attempting to teach philosophy as a skill or a practice or whatever. It's a notion of what constitutes good teaching. And I think that, and I admire your attempts to bring philosophy, I think you said with a big P, and maybe we have to calibrate, you know, the size of the P, and that's it, is what I would call little p philosophy, I think is everywhere to be found. I quoted the example of a horse before, simply because people think, well, it's just a concrete thing. And if you're really interested in horses and want to study them, then you go to veterinary college or something, and you learn more about horses and so on. But the point is that all learning about anything is concept construction. I mean, in physics, you're continually constructing concepts, because every time you learn something new about X, Y, or Z, it's going to shift how you think of and understand this, that, or the other. And so there's a vast network of concepts, which in a sense, that's the challenge for both teachers and students as they go through from, you know, the very elementary, learn this fact, learn that fact, this is how the world is, that's, and so on, through to, you know, advanced physics, where you begin to realize, oh, crikey, you know, these words are just tools for trying to, as it were, understand something that's incredibly mysterious. I mean, the world, both at the micro level and also at the macro level, is just very mysterious. And all human attempts to either capture it or to manipulate it and so on, well, not all human attempts, but most human attempts are done through words, and if not through words, then through other symbols that in some way represent the world, but never fully, never adequately. That's my view.
There and then.
More and more obsessed with being able to get evidence of every aspect of How do you stop the kind of critical thinking or analysis you're talking about being in fact a parody of that? So that what you get. So for example, citizenship existed about 10 years ago. Subject. And within that the idea of an active citizen. But in fact what tended to happen was that people got taught a list of things that an active citizen is. Parrot kind of arguments, parrot whole discussion, both sides of the discussion. It's not really critical thinking, it's parody of it. But there's a danger that the way our education system works, that's what happens every time you try and create critical thinking, pretty much in any subject. How do you avoid that?
I guess it comes back to the aims and the practices of the teacher. I mean, there's always, if you're going to have formal subjects or disciplines or even projects in schools, then there will inevitably be some form of measurement of that, and everybody will have to play that game. But within that frame, I think it sort of partly goes back to what Mark was talking about, you know, as a teacher, you will, I think, normally speaking, and the best teachers surely do, have other objectives. And so I taught the AS critical thinking exam for a year, almost because I wanted to see what it was like. And it was in some way a bit of a parody, you know. This is how you construct the argument, or this is how you show that you understand how to or deconstruct an argument, and so on. And look, I'm not showing off about this, but I'll just share with you. I decided that for the first 2 terms out of the 3 terms, I wouldn't pay attention to the syllabus at all. I just set the kids, this is obviously 6th form, on different projects. I said, well, find something that you're interested in, and you know, you'll take your turn, present it to the students, to your fellows, and we'll think about it and we'll question it and so on. And I remember the most fantastic project was by a student on Chomsky. Well, Chomsky isn't normally studied at school. He jolly well should be, yeah. And the student came across it for himself and did a fantastic presentation. And, you know, a lot of critical thinking went on authentically. But then they went on and got good results. Yeah.
When I first started, certainly that opportunity. Your managers were nowhere near as
Yeah.
what you were expecting to do. You granted a certain amount of freedom to explore tangents.
Yes.
And to maybe you'd be expected to plan broadly what you deliver over a term. Now you're expected to show what you're delivering week on week, lesson on lesson, minute by minute lesson, and that is checked up on. And you know, I think that room you're talking about is systematically being squeezed out.
Yeah, you're very likely to be right about that. And I think maybe this is a stirring call. Probably near the end, aren't we, Nigel?
I hope we've got 10 minutes.
Oh, 10 minutes, okay. Well, I'll just make the stirring call. I think that the teaching profession, and particularly the head teachers, have been craven in accepting that system. in a sense, I opted out of it 30 years ago for partly that reason, and I'm both proud and ashamed of that.
I've got a different answer. That I've been involved in writing critical thinking tests and wrote a book about critical thinking. I think there are technical aspects of critical thinking. People often say we value critical thinking, but there are almost routines and training possibilities in critical thinking which are neglected by philosophers and other people who value critical thinking. It would be very easy to devise online training in critical thinking with correct and incorrect answers and feedback on those answers, and when you gave the wrong answer, why this wasn't the right answer, why you might have been misled in a particular way, within constrained environments, as it were, within, you have a passage and you have to identify a certain sort of move, what sort of evidence might lead to what conclusion. And people can get better through those kind of drills. Going back to the musical instrument thing, you wouldn't think you could play the piano without playing scales. Why do we think people can just learn to pick up critical thinking on the hoof? We could be much better in our education of philosophers and people who are benefiting from philosophy and critical thinking in how we devise our education system. We sort of take it for granted that people pick up the stuff just by being around it, but it doesn't. I don't think that's the most efficient way. I think a combination, and then applying those sorts of moves once you've got a firm grasp of what the different moves are and why something might be a fallacy or whatever. You can then start to see that in other contexts. Maybe one more question. Quick question, yeah? Oh, sorry, two of you. Okay. Let's get them both one after the other and take them both together. Go on, quickly.
Don't get kids asking one questioning authority as arbitrary.
Okay.
So one question too many, and how do you respond to it? And
maybe we should learn to ask one question too many. No, I mean, it hasn't happened to me. But maybe that's because the construct isn't like that, really. I mean, they're not asking me questions. They're asking questions, if you like, to the group or of each other and so on. So if your question now is, well, do they as a group ever go too far and start questioning authority and so on? Again, actually, typically no. And I think, well, I say typically, I mean, actually no. And I think that is because maybe it's just intuitive. They realize when it's done well, and I keep having to say this, it is about building the right atmosphere in the classroom. This turns out to be very precious to them. This is their time, once a week or however often it might be. And I think they'd realize that if they started kicking up either in the class or out of the class, that they'd be spoiling their own party, really, to put it in that sort of frame. I mean, generally the experience both of the teachers and of the students is that this is a time of freedom, yes, but also responsibility, a direct personal responsibility to the rest of the class, to yourself, to talk and think about stuff that actually is quite important. I mean, at the end of the day, and I was a maths teacher, I taught quadratic equations, but they're not so important. Some people have to learn them, but not a lot. Is that okay?
And what do we get from children?
And what do we get from children? Yeah. Well, what do we always get from children? And look, that is the loose end. Philosophy for children, we think of it as just like primary, but children means like secondary as well. And there's philosophy for communities, which is adults following the same procedures. And I could say something a bit corny, and I will. Philosophy for children can appeal to the child in the adult, So, you know, and what is that? What is that the child brings? It's a certain amount of wonder and humility, because they know that they don't know it all. There's lots of grown-ups who do think they know it all, and the kids don't, and they are happy to change their minds, especially if their friends persuade them. So there's an openness. In the best classes, there's care about the topic, about each other, and so on. That frankly you just don't get in the standard classroom, because that's not the name of the game. You know, it makes no difference whether you care about your neighbour, normally speaking, because you've got your test or you've got your essay to write, and you just do it. It's a private thing. And Lippmann was very strong on this. He said, and he was following Vygotsky, the great psychologist, in saying that, you know, the best learning, both from the effectiveness point of view, but from the nurturing point of view, is social learning.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I understand the drink served in the foyer as well, which is to continue the discussion. Thanks very much for your questions.
Thank you indeed. Lovely seeing you.